by Tom Balco. Narrated by Randy McCartan. Hark, how the bells. The bells were the last thing Eli wanted to hear, but Father Mahoney pulled the rope in his quarters to signal the start of Mass nonetheless. They reminded him of a Christmas long ago, one best left forgotten. It had been almost 30 years since Eli first grew to hate the sound of a bell on Christmas Eve, whether it be tolled, rung, or jingled. The very idea of metal and brass clanging against itself made the disheveled man wildly uncomfortable since that fateful morning. He tried his best to keep the recollection buried beneath the snow and pain of the past. But always on Christmas came the bells, and with them, the memories. Eli had been but a boy back then, just 5 years of age, when he first heard the sound coming from his older brother's room down the hall. A tiny festive jingle of merriment that barely woke the child up from his shallow sleep. It signaled more than the morning, but rather that the time to open presents was here at last, for the 25th of December had finally arrived. Eli was anticipating the day so greatly that both he and his only sibling Ray had snuck out of their rooms the previous night in order to steal one gift each from under the tree. It was a night so silent and still that, as they did so, the last remaining bit of snow from a small passing storm could softly be heard falling onto the windowsill. Ray had claimed to see Santa's shadow pass his room, carrying a large gift, which is what had prompted them to slunk under the tree so early in the first place. The boys themselves were sure to be reticent while sneaking around, but quietly taking one gift each before sunrise was a vain and mostly futile attempt to satiate their excitement for the holiday that their family was so besotted with. Only a few hours had passed since the two children had executed their little deception, and the sound of that small waking jingle caused Eli to run straight back to the tree in the living room when the sun came up, a noise he was acutely familiar with, for he himself was making it as he burst down the hallway with joy. The faint metal clanking was coming from the small bells on the elf pajamas that each of the boys wore every Christmas, a tweed tradition started by their mother and father, who thankfully weren't woken up by the noisy attire during the previous night's caper, when the boys had so slyly made away with their early presents. Eli had been somewhat disappointed when he opened his gift alone that night before Christmas. After tearing away the tightly folded striped paper in the confines of his room, nothing more was revealed than a small pair of gray socks with brightly colored flames stitched into their sides. He'd been instantly jealous of his brother's gift upon seeing the dull and poorly sewn material. For whatever Ray had taken, it was surely better than socks. His older brother walked away with a much larger gift that Christmas Eve. A heavy box, cloaked in sleek red wrappings, that was sealed with a shimmering black bow. He dreamt all night about what could have been under the red and black trappings of his brother's gift. The possibilities ran wild. It could have been anything. It could have been everything. Maybe even the greatest gift ever given in Eli's young imagination. He couldn't wait to ask Ray what it was later that morning. The contents of whatever that box could have possibly have held, however, would haunt him for almost the next 3 decades. For as he sat in church in the skin of a much older and wearier man, the clatter of the bells refused to let him forget what had happened next. The tree had been perfectly lit, with the sunlight refracting off the hanging thin tinsel and ornaments in an illuminating display of brilliance. A sea of presents flowed beneath its branches, each holding the promise of something wonderfully special. His parents sat lovingly on the couch beside the spectacle in matching green robes, drinking hot cocoa. Everything was picturesque, except that Ray hadn't come out yet to celebrate and complete their ensemble. The eldest brother was always the first one up, which made it all the more confusing as to why he hadn't joined everyone else around the tree. Eli was certain that Ray was awake, though, for the jingling sound coming from his room suggested that somebody was shuffling about in their pajamas. Their father surmised as much, too, as he soon instructed his youngest son to go fetch his brother from his room. It was just a short walk back down the hallway again, but in retrospect, it felt like an eternity. The details of each step were perfectly preserved and endlessly prolonged in a perpetual misery from that day on. A cold, prominent draft coming from the room at the end of the hall. The smell of a roasting honeyed Christmas ham in the oven, filling the entirety of the house with its aroma. The festive wreath loosely hanging on his older brother's door. And of course, the sound of the tiny bells coming from the other side of that door. The last things he would ever know as a normal child. Eli must have turned the knob, but his recollection had since blocked out that detail. For in his mind, the door had creaked open all on its own. The first thing felt was a chilly winter's wind brutally dragging across his face. It came from the bedroom window, which had been left wide open. It wasn't the wind that permanently changed the course of the young boy's life that holiday, but rather what the freezing air was whisking about in a haunting fashion. Ray had received a jump rope last Christmas, and now that same rope was securely wrapped around the bedroom ceiling fan, with the other end firmly tied around the young boy's neck. His limp little body gently swayed back and forth in the center of the room, as his left leg occasionally tapped the wall beside his corpse. Each time it did, the small bell from his elf pajamas would jingle. Hark, indeed. It was the only sound in the whole world that existed, as everything else went mute and dark. The 5-year-old boy could not process what his brother had done to himself, as his own body went stiff and numb. He knew enough not to stare. That was the only solidified thought his young mind could grasp. But it was hard not to when his brother's once rosy face stared back in frozen agony, with bloodshot eyes and purple, mottled skin. When Eli's head did finally turn away, he found himself looking at his older brother's dresser, or rather, what was on top of it. The large gift Ray had taken the night before stood tall and fully opened at the dresser's edge. It was too high up for the small boy to actually see inside. He could only tell that the bow was untied and that the lid had been removed. Yet what Eli couldn't see did not stop him from feeling what he felt. For what he felt was suddenly overbearing. What he felt was that something terrible was in that box. What he felt was irrational and unexplainable, but what he felt was simply and truly horror. A horror in its purest form, the foreboding of a secret not meant to be known. But he had to know it. Why? The young boy wondered. The box called to Eli so much that his recently deceased brother's swaying body felt like it was 1,000 miles away in a different life, as opposed to hanging right in front of him in that very room. Looking at the gift brought about such dreadful focus and discomfort, but he felt that turning away would somehow make those feelings even worse. His body moved closer and closer to the gift, but he was again unsure as to the reason. He despised it, feared it in every way possible, yet he had to look inside. His small fingers had reached the edge of the dresser and brushed along the corners of the slick box with an unwanted trembling curiosity. The internal emotional conflict within the child at that very moment almost caused him to completely shut down. But the strange present wouldn't allow it. He went to pull the mysterious gift closer to his face to finally peek inside its dark cardboard walls, when one of the worst sounds imaginable broke the ghastly spell that had taken over his mind. Eli's mother screamed at the top of her lungs when she entered the room to see her firstborn dangling from the ceiling. It was a scream so blood-curdlingly sharp that it still haunted Eli almost as much as the bells did. She grabbed her only remaining son in a hysterical fit as she threw herself, while cradling the confused and frightened child, into the hallway, where they both landed hard on hands and knees. The boy's father frantically rushed over after hearing such an alarming commotion. Before he could aid his sobbing wife, however, Ray's swaying corpse caught the corner of his eye. The man of the house let out a cry that was far different than his sobbing partner's, yet it still carried the same weight. He ran into Ray's room and slammed the door behind him quickly afterwards, presumably to take his son's body down from the ceiling. Eli wasn't quite sure what happened after that. The next time he would see his brother would be in a casket. And as for the box that would beset this child's imagination well into adulthood, he never saw it again. For the longest time, he would ask his parents about the strange red and black present, but they both denied ever seeing it or providing such an odd gift under the tree. Nor did anybody find one in the bedroom that morning. But Eli never forgot about it, as the bells would not permit this. That box was real. He had seen it. He felt the horror. It was the reason why Ray killed himself. He was sure of that. The only certainty that ever seemed true from that day on. Time had not been kind to the small family since the years following the suicide. His parents divorced not long afterwards, unable to look at one another without being reminded of the terror of that day, which made Eli's existence all the more painful to them. His father eventually started a new family, abandoning the old one, and his mother passed away from a rare form of pancreatic cancer before he even reached the age of 20. In the end, she had left behind only a decade of nihilism from that Christmas morning, and a son she could hardly stomach the sight of. But she was all Eli had left. The young man struggled tremendously after her passing, spending most of his days in poverty and sin to dull the pain. Small little slivers of solace were found only in the arms of paid strangers or the escapism of a laced needle. Never did he feel wanted or loved again. Those sentiments had died in the cold with Ray. More and more time continued to achingly fall off the calendar. And just as the miserable young man toyed with the idea of making 29 his last year on Earth, God had seemingly offered him some sort of lifeline and direction in the form of a child, a daughter, fittingly christened Hope. She was born unexpectedly from a woman who had been little more than a hateful one-night stand. Eli knew not of the child's existence until the very day she arrived, when he received a frantic call from the hospital. He decided when first seeing her that the innocent girl would be named after the last bit of wishful thinking and optimism that still somehow resided within his heart. That responsibility would be the first of many shoved onto her father, since the child's other parent did not want anything to do with her or him and quickly left town before the baby could even sit upright. Adoption had briefly crossed his mind afterwards, but a weary Eli did not want Hope to endure an unloved fate similar to what he had experienced. So he begrudgingly decided to raise her on his own. This was often tough, but Eli did his best at being a parent, cleaning up his act to the most of his abilities and finding a steady job and a small apartment for the two of them to live in. Sobriety, unfortunately, would come and go in a never-ending battle for inner peace. But for that, he went to church. The words of the gospel and the songs of the choir would soothe his soul in times of need. Mass was where he ultimately came to feel the most at home, and when Hope turned 5 herself, Eli started taking her with him more frequently. The two of them would regularly arrive late, however, and the little girl never knew why they would always enter St. Anthony's Cathedral well after the tolling of the bells. For most of Hope's life, Eli had been able to keep up the charade of being relatively put together for his daughter. But on the holidays, things became more of a challenge. Come December, church was more than a weekly refuge, but instead a daily necessity, with his depression only growing worse and worse until Christmas Eve finally reared its hideous head. Melancholy, fear, and self-deprecation would annually spread throughout the impoverished man like a disease on that final month of the year. There were days when he felt like a complete loser, and others when he damn well knew that he was. It was not as if Eli wasn't a good person. He just wasn't all that good at being a person. Every Christmas, all the townspeople carried themselves as if they were returning magic to the air, like Santa Claus was real and might actually be coming to deliver them presents and joy and wonderment. It was a notion that the bitterly jaded Eli always dreaded, for gifts, too, would trigger the memories of the past. The holidays for him were a curse to be endured, not a time to be celebrated. That is why he never once bought a gift for his own child, lest he scar her, too. This year might have almost been tolerable, had Mass not started late. Eli was sure that arriving 20 minutes after the scheduled time would be enough to separate him from the ungodly clanging he despised so much. As fate would unfortunately have it, Father Mahoney himself was running behind from a previous engagement too. And when the priest finally did enter St. Anthony's just moments after Eli and Hope did, he proceeded by pulling the rope in his quarters to toll the bells. The final Christmas Eve Mass had at last begun for the night. Hope was confused as to why her father was suddenly frozen stiff in place with a 1,000-yard stare as she sat quietly in the pew beside him. She did not know that with every sway of the bell's clapper, Eli would see his brother's fresh corpse pendulating from the ceiling of his old room, twirling in a ghostly wind, twirling beside that red and black box holding its horrible secret. Eli's hands scratched deeply then into the Bible that was clutched so tightly into his chest. The preceding sermon was all background to the memories of that morning, obscuring the calm present with piercing shards of an unwanted past. Hope, in her innocence, thought that her father was only enthralled with the beauty of the church, never once thinking that his staring out into the ether was an expressionless mask to hide the endless suffering inside of himself. Eli went through the motions. He sang to the hymns, shook hands for peace, and received communion at the altar, weakening with each task. All he could see when performing these acts was Ray, and all he heard were the bells. Mass was just a half hour, but it might as well have been half a century, with how the tolling brass had left him feeling. Eli could now only operate in an internally petrified state of misery, akin to a waking sleep paralysis. It felt like 30 years ago, all over again. He wanted to cry and crawl under the pews forever, but such a display couldn't be enacted in front of his daughter, so he just continued to pantomime normalcy. One by one, the rest of the churchgoers left their aisles and slowly exited the holy sanctuary when the service ended. Father Mahoney waited by the doors to greet each one of them and wish them a Merry Christmas until only two remained. Eli still sat at his seat, clutching his Bible again, with Hope at his side. The priest at first was confused by their staying, but when Father Mahoney walked over to greet them, he could soon see that there was a great sadness lurking just below the surface of his old friend. Over the years, Eli had come to the priest many times for guidance and comfort, so the good father was very much aware of the frightened man's story and what this time of year meant to the downtrodden disciple. Little Hope just twiddled her thumbs and swung her feet back and forth, unsure as to why they were not leaving, blissfully ignorant to the fact that her father was paralyzed with an unfathomable loathing and lament. Father Mahoney did not wish to alarm the small, happy girl with this unfortunate truth, and thought it best that she come with him so that her dad could have some time to himself. The priest could see that Eli needed a moment to reflect and pray in order to break the terrible malaise that he was stuck in. With his last bit of energy, Eli found the strength to take the priest up on his offer and nodded his head in assent. Father Mahoney then calmly took Hope's tiny hand and guided her towards the vestibule so that the two of them could take a short walk outside around the grounds of the church. This act of kindness had left Eli all alone to collect himself in the peaceful confines of the empty chapel. He took the time to pray and ask for forgiveness for the life he had lived, to be free from the shackles and chains of the past, the wrongs that he had made from his own indecencies, the ones that were forged link by link, yard by yard, all the way back to that morning 3 decades ago. He knew that he had allowed one moment to define who he was, but knew not how it happened or how to break the chain. For this answer, he continued to pray as the ringing of bells from yesteryear continued to rack his soul. He thought the noise would never go away as the reverberating brass grew louder and louder into practically deafening tones, until suddenly it did stop. A heavy silence fell over the church, a special kind of silence, the kind that comes only with the cold, the kind that comes at night after a snowfall, which sure enough had just recently started with a passing storm. Eli was perplexed by this sudden lack of sound and knew in his heart that its presence could be no good omen. He looked over his shoulder after feeling a familiar winter chill at his back to see the front door of the church start to slowly hang open on its own. It did so in a fashion that was identical to the way that Ray's bedroom door had opened decades before. That feeling of horror had returned in full force. He did not ever want to leave the pew, but inexplicably felt compelled to do so. When his shaking legs managed to finally make his body stand, Eli slowly stepped into the aisle with great unease. His heavy breathing could be seen before his face as the whole church was now ice cold. His heart raced uncontrollably, but his feet moved as if they were lead. Walking down the aisle to the front of the church could have just as easily have been the hallway from his old childhood home. Somebody, or something, would be certainly waiting for him outside. But answers evaded him again, as he knew not who or why. The winds thrashed across his face relentlessly until the trembling man was a mere few feet from the open door. Eli kept his head down for the last remaining steps until finally he found himself in the elements at the top of the church's snowy stairs. He peered across the street to see Father Mahoney holding Hope's hand as the two of them walked along the graves in the adjacent cemetery. Eli had an idea of where they were going, but not how he felt about it. For something greater was of concern. There was still that slight snowfall in the air, and it was through its hue of white winter haze that a stranger soon revealed themselves. Amongst the tombstones on the far side of the cemetery from where his priest and daughter were walking, a barely visible cloaked figure could be seen. It had no discernible features other than what the snow revealed as the tiny frozen flakes slid off the specter's silhouette. It could have passed for the personification of the wind, had its vague features not been so distinctly human. Eli stood perfectly still as he locked eyes with the creature in the cemetery, eyes the cloaked figure did not have, for all the snow gave was the suggestion of a person. It moved towards him in a menacing way, leaving no footprints on the ground as it did so. All that came with the form of the ghost was silence, a silence that was as deafening as it was damning. For the first time ever, the bells were missed. The sentient shadow continued to creep across the cemetery until it finally reached the edge of the gates. In one swift motion, it melted through the bars of the barricade and onto the street. Once the specter crossed the road, its moving briefly paused. With no clear motive, the creature stood no more than 20 feet or so from Eli at the bottom of the church steps. He was far beyond fear, because at this point, he was half certain it was death itself that had come for him. Only one thing had stopped Eli from believing this fully, and that was an innate instinct that the creature before him was in some way or another a woman. There was no evidence to confirm or deny this notion, just the smallest of gut feelings that was buried beneath the wealth of revulsion and angst at the pit of his stomach. The shadow began to move up the stairs at a much slower pace than before as Eli became completely numb. It did not matter how much closer it got, since the specter still had no discernible features, even at point-blank range. Still, the anguish and horror it brought about with its presence became more palpable with every inch it moved forward. Dread weighed him down, as if it had its own gravity, with the cloaked figure now almost close enough to touch. Eli closed his eyes and braced for the worst. Whatever it wanted, whatever it would do to him, it would surely be horrid. Beneath the pitch-black curtains provided by his eyelids, projections played of all the ways this shadow had come to hurt him, to take what little life he had left. But something else entirely happened instead. The painful, anticipating seconds passed like nails on a chalkboard when his eyes snapped back open to see an empty street before him. The cloaked figure was gone, seemingly vanished into the wisps of the winter wind. Relief was so close to washing over the clearly drained and shaken man then. But when he brought his attention to look down, however, he quickly realized what the apparition had left in its wake. Nestled neatly at the tips of his feet sat an early Christmas present, unwrapped in sleek red paper and packaged with a shimmering black bow. It wasn't like the one Ray had received. It was the one Ray had received. He knew this with every fiber of his being. Looking out across the way immediately afterwards, Eli could still see Hope and Father Mahoney in the cemetery, and did not wish for either of them to look upon the gift or feel the maddening curiosity that came with it. So he picked it up to bring inside. The package barely had any weight when lifted, to the point where it felt unnatural. Had he not been holding it in his hands, Eli wouldn't even have been sure if the mysterious gift actually occupied space in this plane of existence at all. 30 years later, that box still terrified him to his very core. But beneath that fear was a 5-year-old boy who had to know what was inside. The cold wind ushered him back into the church as the door slowly closed behind him. The glow of the candles did not make the building feel any warmer, with the chapel resembling more of a tomb as time passed. Never before had Eli actually gone inside of Father Mahoney's quarters, but he felt that smaller, more intimate confines were needed for opening this box. The wide-open nature of the church's main foyer made it seem as though God himself were watching, and this was something he did not want God to see. The priest's chamber lay somewhere between a bedroom and office in terms of decor. Not inviting nor displeasing, just pleasant enough for the solace needed to open the gift. He placed the box on Father Mahoney's desk and simply stared at it for a solid minute. Within its 4 small walls were answers he was no longer sure he wanted, but it was a thought that proved irrelevant, for they were answers he needed. A trembling hand finally reached for one end of the black bow and pulled on it ever so delicately. The ribbon fully untied itself on its own after the slight tug, as if the gift begged to be opened. The 2 halves of the ribbon then fell to either side of the box. The lid shook afterwards, as did his hand, but still he knew that it would not completely open unless he desired it. The cold temperature of the room no longer mattered, as sweat dripped from every pore of his body. But the time for turning back had passed. At long last, Eli finally lifted the lid to see what was inside. When the tightly wrapped red lid first came off, the edges of a thick type of gray stone could immediately be seen, which instantly contradicted its light weight. Once the top was fully removed, the stone was then revealed to form a hollow circular diameter whose circumference perfectly touched each wall of the box, leaving only its corners empty. Looking down at it, the whole thing seemed like the top of an ancient vase. The only characteristic to suggest otherwise was that the vase had no bottom. Nothing but an endless darkness occupied where its contents and base should be. It was a darkness that moved and swirled with a vacant sense of hunger, but it was what lay beyond the moving black void that grabbed Eli from within. He could not see it with his eyes, but instead saw it with his soul. What he saw was simply everything, and not just all the things that were, but all the things that could have been. He saw through time to the beginnings of man and the paradise that came before this world, how the utopia would have continued to flourish had it not been bequeathed a gift that was meant to be forever unopened, until one day, the first true day, it was. A woman peered inside, and from the gift poured all the horrors and terrors of the world. Mortality, fear, and time each came flowing out of the gift like a flood of eternal pain, and with them came plague, famine, war, and all the other terrors that held mankind in its forever cycle of suffering. This woman may have been the first person to open the gift, but she would not be the last. Centuries turned into millennia as every single year she shared the gift over and over again with someone she thought might understand her pain, who might understand what this world itself is, but a misunderstanding, a mistake made in curiosity and nurtured by vanity. People from all walks of life had received her gift in different types of packages. It had been given to kings and queens, soldiers and scholars, peasants and townspeople alike, all with the same unfortunate ending. And one year, it appeared under a beautiful Christmas tree and was taken by a little boy. When he looked inside to see all the events and people who came before him, along with what could have been of them and himself, he did the only thing that made sense afterwards and took his own life, just as they all had. 29 more would receive the gift until Eli found that he was now staring at himself. Every emotion that was humanly possible, plus a few more, repeatedly sped through his body and mind in rapid succession as he relived every moment he had ever had. He was then shown all the lives that could have been, the ones where he was brave, the ones where he was rich, the ones where he was kind, all leading him to the conclusion that he had been living his worst possible life, and that this would woefully continue unless something was done about it. The final revelation he saw before the darkness dissipated was the thing all of his decisions had led to. At the very bottom of the vase, he saw what was now. He saw his daughter, on her knees in the snow, drawing a heart in the fresh powder over the grave of an uncle she had never met. Father Mahoney stood over her as the little girl blew Ray's tombstone a kiss, and with that kiss, everything stopped. Eli looked down, only to gaze upon a normal vase within the box. All he had seen had happened in less than a second, but he could not unsee it. No mind could have possibly retained all of the memories and lives he had just received, but enough had stayed to understand the general feeling of them all. The residual silence still remained, with Eli standing in it for minutes until he finally found the urge to move again. He calmly walked over to the lone window in Father Mahoney's room to let the sounds of the season score that silence. The fresh air came in as well, and as the man who had just walked through lifetimes stared out at the frozen white landscape, the first concrete thoughts since opening the box began to creep into his mind. It was December 24th, all right. He could feel the world's depression floating about in the night sky. He began to ponder a theory as to why this was. It was more than just the general sense of loneliness that was shared by a plenitude of his fellow man. He felt instead an inauthenticity in the air, like smog to the lungs. And not just the kind that comes in the form of shallow consumerism, pitting people against each other, where they secretly hope for something worthless, like the title of Best Gift Giver. Nor did the inauthenticity come in the form of shitty surface-level art that gets recycled over and over again all month long, as if the average person will somehow forget Jingle Bell Rock if it isn't jammed down their throats at a constant frenzy every hour on the hour. No. The inescapable feeling of fraudulence felt came from a truth hidden underneath the warm Yuletide camaraderie, like a dark void lurking just beneath all the pretty white winter snow. It was something Eli had known his whole life, but could only now just fully realize. The truth was that tomorrow would be just like any other day, but the hopeful out there shamefully think otherwise. Sure, gifts would be opened, families would be reunited, dinners would be shared, but all of these things were just tinsel over what will really happen on the day. Children would be abducted, women would be raped, and men would continue to find new and creative ways to murder and steal from one another. Eli's pondering left him to consider why the good of Christmas was not as consistent as the evils it ignored. Should not the morals of the holiday apply to every day of the year? Even worse, in less than a week, people would yet again lie to themselves with hollow resolutions of being smarter and kinder and better for all the new years that will simply yield the same old results. He knew firsthand, however, that age does not make one wiser. It only turns them colder. It all felt so fake, with himself being the worst offender. He was still just a 5-year-old boy, pretending to be a man, pretending like the rest of them. As the chilly wind spun around the room, he could not help but think then of the last thing he saw at the bottom of the box. His daughter, joyfully kneeling at the grave of his brother. Eli did not know if this meant that she was the one good thing to sprout from all of the chaos, or if she was a sign that all of this was to happen again. Was it all a cycle that could never be escaped? A chain that could never be broken? The exasperated man was stuck on this particular thought when he realized something radical had changed within himself. He no longer felt fear or depression, and gone was the general sense of horror. Instead, his emotions were replaced by nothing at all. He was so suddenly and exquisitely empty now, much more calm. Eli looked across the room to see the rope that Father Mahoney pulled every Sunday to signal the start of Mass. He was in awe of the braided twine, as it suddenly reminded him of the jump rope Ray had when they were boys. It hung directly across from the open window of the room, and before Eli walked over to it, he looked outside one more time and wondered, did I hate the world so much because I didn't fit within it? Or did I not fit in because of my hatred? Life is a gift, but it can feel like getting a pair of socks on Christmas. Hope was making snow angels on Ray's grave as Father Mahoney had his back to her, staring intently at the glowing Christmas moon. He gazed at it with sadness for the little girl in the snow. For the good priest couldn't shake the idea that she would live a life similar to that of her father. He knew from his years of hearing confession that pain was not just something that could be inflicted, but that it could be inherited as well. He thought about lassoing the moon and giving it to her to make up for all the gifts that she had never received and would never receive throughout her life. But that sort of thing only happened in the movies. The thought soon passed as it was broken by the sound of the church bells resonating through the night. It was a noise that both confused and somewhat frightened Father Mahoney, for there was no reason for them to be tolled so late. As the bells clattered and the priest took a few fearful steps towards the direction of the church, Hope sat straight up from the frozen, powdered ground. She had felt the most unusual wind rush across her face. When the girl then turned around to check where it came from, she saw a cloaked shadow within the light snowfall, directly beneath the shining moon. She sensed there was something motherly about the dark spirit, as it held an intriguing gift, one sealed in red wrapping paper and tied with a shimmering black bow. This notion, sadly, could have been coming from the empty place inside her heart that always yearned for a mother who never was. She waved towards the direction of the silhouette, not knowing if it was a ghost of Christmases past or present. But as the specter faded into the night's lessening snowfall, Hope wondered if in the future she would ever see it again.
Hey, hope you guys enjoyed that story. If you did, check out our other ones and subscribe so that you can get notifications when the new ones are posted. You can also check out their written forms on Wattpad, along with my first collection of shorts. And be sure to acknowledge the names in these end credits as well, because everyone put a lot of really hard work into making this a reality, and I can't thank them enough. If you'd like to support us so that we can make these even better and faster, that can be done through the links in the description. There's a Patreon where you can get early access to new stories and physical copies of all my writing, or you can just buy us a cup of coffee on Ko-Fi. Either way, thanks for listening, and hope to see you guys again soon for the next one.